Thank you for all coming along and good morning. For those who don't know me, I'm Oliver Mantell, Director of Evidence at the Audience Agency, and I'm joined here by my colleagues Elise and of course Tessa, not in fact Isaac today. I think he's off ill, but if Elise and Tessa just want to say a quick hello.
Sure. Hi everyone, my name is Elise and I'm a researcher in the evidence team at the Audience Agency.
Oh, and I'm Tessa. Hopefully I know most of you, all of you. I'm the Service and Community Manager for Scotland at the Audience Agency. So yeah, hello. Welcome on this very cold morning. The morning that I managed to find one slipper. So yes, that was a bit of a panic. I had to go and find different shoes to wear. So yes, anyway. It's not good on a cold morning like this to only find one slipper. But there you go.
Cool. Just before we start in terms of practicalities, if you want live transcription, it's available at the bottom. For purposes of the tape, so to speak, I am a blonde, white, blue-eyed male of a sort of middle age. As when other people start talking, if they want to introduce themselves, they can in that way. On the way through, so we're going to be talking a little bit about the population of Edinburgh and East Central Scotland, and also audiences and audience data we have around the area, with a chance for a bit of a conversation with everyone following up. Obviously, you know the area better than we do. I can say that with absolute confidence because Sarah has shown me around Edinburgh and seen how much I do and don't know. But we can share with you what we have and can see in the data. You can share your perspectives, and then sort of between that we can kind of talk about what that might look like, what that might mean. There are some things in there which have surprised me slightly. They may or may not surprise you. We'll see as we go on. So that's the plan. We're aiming not ideally to take the full 2 hours. I think we've worked out how to slightly streamline what we're saying compared to previously. So hopefully this will be even more of a high adrenaline roller coaster of data fun. But let's see how we get on. Now, I'm fairly confident that Tessa has chatted to all of you about Audience Spectrum at some time or another. If she's met you, then she's almost certainly talked about it. But I will do a little bit of a brief intro on that, if that would be helpful to people. But essentially, we're going to talk about the local area, local audiences, have a bit of a chat and unpick it using lots of different sources of data. So partly sort of population summary, census data, that kind of thing, and partly data from Audience Spectrum, so this sort of segmentation sort of profiling system of the whole population, partly data from Audience Finder that a number of you and many others contribute data to, both survey and ticketing data. We'll largely be talking about ticketing data today, and partly based on the Cultural Participation Monitor, and that is a nationally representative survey that we've been doing in multiple waves since October 2020, asking people about what culture they do, their kind of tick their attitudes, how they're feeling about things, certain hot topics that may be relevant to the moment, like attitudes to the cost of living, how people are responding to COVID. So all of that stuff sort of mashed up together in combination, which will obviously that data sort of apply at different sort of levels, and that's sort of summarised there. So that's broadly speaking what we're looking to chat about and what to expect. And so let's just do a little intro to Audience Spectrum and then carry on. So Audience Spectrum it works as a kind of common language between lots of these different data sources we've been talking about. So we can use it to talk about the population as a whole. We can use it to talk about things like audience finder data. We applied it to the survey data, the participation monitor. So from each of these, we can see people in this particular group are saying these things, they're doing these things, they live in these places, and we can kind of make all of those speak together through this central system. So that's why we're kind of using this at the heart of this conversation. But essentially, it's a tool that takes the whole population of the UK and allocates them to one of 10 groups based on the type and volume of cultural engagement they do. So that's the kind of the primary thing that the groups have been defined on. And then we can then add to that a whole load of other information that we know about those people, you know, various demographic information, attitudinal things, etc., and link it to local geography, so we can map where people who tend to be in these groups tend to live. And hopefully that will map to your experience of the way that particular audiences in Edinburgh are behaving. So, 10 groups, we largely cluster them into 3 major tiers, if you like. So higher engaged groups, which are these 3, medium engaged groups, which are these 3, and lower engaged groups, which are these 3. We've tweaked a couple of names recently, but essentially they're the same groups that you may have seen going back several years. Normally, when we're having conversations with people outside of London, we say there are 3 highly engaged groups, but one of these probably largely won't apply to you because metroculturals are very heavily concentrated in London. The other place they're highly concentrated is Edinburgh. So they are relevant. We will be chatting about them today. But they tend to be the kind of what you might describe as a kind of metropolitan urban professional elite type group. And coupled with them in the high engaged groups, you've got some who tend to be still mainly graduates, but a little bit younger on average, experience seekers, and there are absolutely tons of those in Edinburgh. And then this group, commuter land culture buffs, which tends to be a bit older, a bit more rural, a bit more traditional. And I think there's quite a few of those around as well. So you're kind of blessed with the situation of having lots of all 3 of the highest engaged groups to an extent, which is probably pretty unusual compared to other parts of the UK. And then we have, in the middle, 3 groups who are kind of moderately engaged. They don't necessarily find themselves in terms of culture as their kind of primary motivator or kind of core identity, but nonetheless do attend a fair bit. A couple of those who tend to have a high proportion of families, so dormitory dependables, trips and treats, that tend to be a little bit older, a little bit younger, respectively, a little bit more kind of rural, and or a little bit further out, a bit sort of small town, in contrast. And then finally, we've got the home and heritage, which tends to be kind of older, more rural, more traditional in tastes, heritage interests, hence the name, but sort of, you know, a different moderately engaged group, of whom there are fewer until you get much further out in this area. And there are a variety of lower engaged groups. I don't necessarily want to go through all of them in detail, because we're not probably going to be talking about them in much detail today, just because there are fewer of them around. But there's a mixture of sort of more settled urban communities. So groups that are often really concentrated in northern terraces, like up our streets, much more kind of large city groups like Glasgow Creativity. We do see pockets of them. Young, lower income families, frontline families, and then finally the supported communities, which is a group which is kind of majority older, infirm, often in sheltered accommodation of various sorts, with a sort of minority within that group, which tends to be much younger, but also in kind of council supported accommodation of various types, relatively over engaged. So that's a very quick overview of all the segments. There's much more information about them on our website, and there's a slightly longer summary video which we can share as well. But for each of the segments, if you go to our website, audienceagency.org, there is a little summary of each one, with sort of a few key summary stats, but also then some more detailed information about different attributes, you know, what they do, what they like, where they live, how they engage digitally, and each of those kind of expands out into more detail. And as of the last year, we've also got a second tier of extra granularity where we can split them into subtypes, and we'll touch on a couple of the subtypes as we go through. But essentially it means we've got 10 top tier segments, they split into 20 little subtypes, and the differences between the subtypes can be quite helpful when you're looking at particular high concentrations of certain groups, or the way a particular group seems to be behaving in a particular situation. So, for example, we said there are lots of experience seekers in Edinburgh. We'll see particularly somebody experienced E1, the sort of socially minded midlife professionals. So they're kind of graduates who sort of stuck around, so to speak. And Tessa has shared a link very neatly in the chat to more audience finding information. Yes, I'm very happy to share more about that as and when. But this is a little background, so who the segments are. It was originally made for using taking part survey data, for those who are familiar with that as a kind of summary data set about cultural engagement. It's obviously over time had all sorts of other, just sort of stuck to it, or a different experience informing how we use it. So, any questions before I dive into the actual information? Everyone, is that making sense so far? Cool. So, first up, looking at the local population. So we'll look a bit about the demographics and then look at audience spectrum, in particular where people are, areas of the concentrations of particular types of audiences. So you can see this is the whole area that we're looking at, but obviously most of the people live right there in the middle. And just as a broad overview in terms of demographic picture, we can see that generally speaking, this area tends to be a little bit more diverse. Of course, it contains the major city, a slightly lower proportion of families. That actually gets substantially smaller once you concentrate on Edinburgh itself, with a really highly educated local population compared to standard benchmarks. So, yeah, so over a third with degrees, etc. Very relatively few without any qualifications. It's also slightly below average for retirees, not noticeably, not hugely above average for students, but that's because, again, it's that whole area. Once you zoom in on Edinburgh itself, it's much higher for students and, of course, graduates, hence the education. So, this is the overall audience spectrum profile for East Central Scotland, Scotland as a whole, and the UK. And so here we can see that metroculturals, so MC on the left, this area is above average for the whole of the UK, which is really odd for anywhere outside London. Essentially all of that UK block, or at least 80% of it, is all down there. So that's noticeably prominent, but also these other two higher engaged groups on the left are substantially higher, and absolutely loads of the experience seekers. So that's a group which tends to like lots of kind of quite varied, different, relatively newer art forms. Maybe a tendency to be a little less venue loyal, a little less sort of art form loyal, to try lots of different things, and a bit more price sensitive than other highly engaged groups. So that's probably informing the overall flavour of how audiences are behaving, particularly in Edinburgh. And you can see relatively lower concentrations of all of the other groups, particularly compared to Scotland as a whole. Glasgow creativity, there were absolutely loads in Glasgow when we did the So, if that's the overall picture, this is with the subsegments. And this is just really just to pull out one or two that are particularly key. When we've said that there are lots of experience seekers, it's worth noting that actually most of them are in the E1 group. So yes, there's a core of the actual students, and we saw where we had, I think it was 9% students overall, 7% of the population are experience seeker E2, so it's in that group. But there are lots of this kind of graduates who have stayed on the edges of major cities. So worth noting. For lots of the other segments, actually, it's a pretty even split, maybe some of the lower engaged ones. Some differentiation if you were particularly interested in looking in detail at targeting any of those. But really, it's that experience seeker group that sticks out to me as kind of the notable thing. Okay, so broad context, 60% of who we're talking about throughout this, when we're talking about the overall group, is Edinburgh population. and that skews heavily towards the metroculturals, experience seekers, you know, the really highly engaged, relatively kind of skew more towards more contemporary arts tastes, more students, more younger people. Of course, as you get further out into the Lothians of various sorts, you end up with higher concentrations of families, also higher concentration of retirees. And Mid-Lothian, you've got more of a kind of so skilled trades, slightly sort of what you might sort of call sort of Middle Brittany kind of young families, etc. Groups being a little bit more prominent there as well. So that's just a bit of a flavour of the different areas where we're looking at, which I'm sure won't be any great surprise. Maybe worth noting that in East Lothian, with lots of this Upper Streets group, that's the one I talked about being potentially lots of quite settled communities and sort of terraces and the like. Okay, so we talked about experience seekers and them being a core group, and sure enough, very concentrated on Edinburgh itself, really not that many further afield, maybe little pockets down the A1, but nothing too much. And if we zoom in, you can see that it's, you know, yes, fair bit in Leith, etc., but really it's the centre and down towards the universities is where they're concentrated. So yes, yeah, worth noting that it is sticking pretty central for these groups. Metrocultural is even more concentrated, and so if you see that the way these maps are scaled, you can see that the ring road, there's really kind of clear space inside that. So metroculturals are just really more in the kind of northwest of the city. Is that Mills? Is that the name? So yeah, it's worth noting that that's where they are, and in certain pockets in really high concentrations. So we're seeing that, you know, getting up to 90% of the local population in particular areas. This metroculturals group, but it's very much little hotspots. We'll talk a little bit later on about how these different segments are behaving relative to cost of living and COVID and things. And yeah, it'll be clear. So some of these audience groups are, you know, really quite front compared to others. So one of the factors that's obviously quite closely correlated with cultural engagement is professional occupations. There's a bit more of a geographical spread once you start to include all professional occupations rather than just it being concentrated on those two particular groups. So you are seeing pockets further out to the west, further out to the east, but yeah, still same sort of areas of west of the centre, just further south of the centre, being particularly prominent, and still reasonably high proportion up in Leith and so forth. So yeah, and then as you get further in, again, you start to recognise these recurring patterns. The students are pretty concentrated. So obviously that's what the sort of campus out beyond the ring road, but otherwise it's sort of just around the university itself, and then yeah, a bit of a spread, but pretty concentrated. Okay. And finally, where the families live. Now, families are quite interesting at the moment because they've post-COVID been much more likely to be highly engaged than other groups, as a general rule, and there could be a variety of reasons for that. But I suspect it's a combination of, if you've got children in the household, they've always been kind of mixing with people through most of COVID one way or another. So probably COVID was less of a barrier. People tend to be more culturally engaged with children, at least over the age of about 4. The engagement tends to be inflated by having children rather than reduced for the younger ages. So there is a tendency for families to have slightly higher engagement on average, but the pockets where the families are very much pushed out to the outskirts. I'm sure anyone who's tried to buy or rent in central Edinburgh will not be surprised that family homes are relatively less affordable right in the centre. That's probably a fair assumption from what I've heard. So So there, yeah. So that's really worth noting, really quite how shelves and rosters there. Then by segment, and bits of this will help you probably much more than it helps me, I imagine, because you'll know some of these areas and therefore know if that's the area and these are the people that live there, and I've got a bit of a sense of who's in each segment. That's the intention anyway. Worth noting that Leith Walk ward has more experience seekers than literally anywhere else in the UK. Not the highest proportion. I think you go to Headingley and Leeds for the highest proportion from memory, but highest sheer number of experience seekers. So if you want to find yourself an experience seeker, that's where they're.
That's amazing, Ollie. Sorry, I just thought I'd comment on that. Yeah.
It is quite something, isn't it? And you see Leith itself.
That's quite something.
But we do, I mean, the Edinburgh profile population is genuinely quite exceptional relative to other places. Similarly, metroculturals, we've said that they're absolutely stacked up in London, and yet the 5th highest in the country is in Edinburgh. So the 5th highest ward is Edinburgh. And just to clarify, because I know when I first looked at this, I was like, if it's the 5th highest in the UK, why is it only 2nd highest on this list? It's because there's a higher proportion in Inverleith, but there's a higher overall population as in settings. But yeah, so absolutely loads, and Morningside, which is famous even this far south. There's a people like that. So yeah, it's a really striking. I think that some of these concentrations, and you'll probably recognise some of the slightly more rural areas, also slightly further out areas, North Berwick coastal, they are right out. You start to get more home heritage, but really not that many. That's probably quite useful because they're the group among more than any other group where their attendance has collapsed post-COVID. So they were a middle engaged group. They're really not coming back in very large numbers at all. So yeah, there aren't many that close in. Okay. So that's a little bit of a run through of the background population. To some extent, will be telling you things you know, and or telling you things you know in a language that you're more or less familiar with. But now if we go on to look at the actual audience, we can then sort of overlay one on the other and start to see who's actually engaging, what they're doing, how they're doing it. I'll hand over to Elise.
Thanks, Ollie. Hi again, everyone. I forgot to do audio description earlier. So for the script, I'm a white woman with short black hair in front of a fake but very colorful library wallpaper. And so we're going to talk about actual audience data now that we have through Audience Finder, our big data aggregating platform that some of you may be contributing to. And essentially what we've done is we've taken as much data as possible from bookers who live in Edinburgh and from organizations that are based in Edinburgh. Now, we couldn't use every single organization that we have available to us because sometimes there was a lack of continuity, that sort of thing. For example, we weren't able to include the Fringe Festival because we only have data for the Fringe for 1 year, and it would have completely skewed everything up in the analysis. So that's just a little bit of a caveat, but we still found some pretty interesting things. So we want to talk them through, and then most importantly, have your feedback and your thoughts on the trends we're seeing, or at least the trends we think we're seeing. So to start us off, we have our audience spectrum profile once again. So in gray is the one we saw before, just the population. And then the colored bars show you the bookers from East Central Scotland, from this area of Edinburgh and the Lothians. And we can see essentially the trend we were seeing in the population is exacerbated in the bookers. We see even more of these three top engaged groups. Almost 2/3 of the whole profile is these three top groups. And again, experienced seekers really towering over everybody else. Although it's worth noting that community and culture buffs and government dependables are holding their own quite well, and we'll see how exactly that plays out through the year and in different genres a little bit later on. Now, that's sort of a lay of the land. Next, we wanted to see when people are most visiting and where. And so we looked at just the local organizations, and I've listed them in purple there at the top, the ones that are included when we talk about local organizations. It's an aggregate of all of these. And these were just the ones where we had, like I was saying, this consistent data throughout. And right now we're looking at a period pre-COVID, so from the financial year 2017-18 up to 2019-20. And we're aggregating that to give us a sort of pre-COVID benchmark. And that'll be important later in a different sense. But for now, we're just looking at sort of getting a picture from the booking data from these local organizations. And these two charts at the bottom, we're seeing a volume of tickets in thousands, in tens of thousands, in fact. Local bookers in green and non-local bookers, so from outside this East Central Scotland area, in red. And right off the bat, it's pretty clear that really the local bookers dominates the landscape during the two most prominent months, August and December, but also during the rest of the year. So that's pretty interesting already. If we think of Edinburgh as obviously a tourist destination, and it's worth noting that this obviously we can't include overseas visitors in this analysis because we don't capture that data. So that's worth keeping in mind. But just in terms of the UK market, this is how it's splitting out, or at least how it was splitting out pre-COVID. Of course, worth noting, August and December are really these two very, very key times of year for Edinburgh and for the culture sector in Edinburgh. And you might be thinking, what about non-local bookers? Local bookers to the non-local organization, so local people going out. And the numbers were so small that it wasn't even worth showing you the chart. So basically, we're going to be focusing on visitors to the local organizations because that's where we saw the most interesting data and the most interesting trends that might be most useful to you. So in this sort of local, non-local split, if we stack them together to really get a sense of how it splits throughout the year, I think the next slide shows it's just that. There we go. Just stack exactly those two bars, so volume of tickets, still the non-locals in red and the locals in green. And you can see our two top key months. August splits roughly 1/3, 2/3, whereas December splits more 3/4, 1/4. So you have a more local audience in the December month, the pantomime month, the Christmas shows month, and the festival month of August, as you might expect, more visitors from further afield. And I didn't include those percentages for the rest of the year, but it never goes very far over this 3/4, 1/4 split, or very far from the 2/3, 1/3. This is kind of the split we're seeing throughout, with always a dominance of local bookers. Now, if we just take those 2 months, August and December, because they seem to be the key ones in terms of volumes of tickets still, and we're going to compare the profile. So this is still MC is Metroculturals, CC is Culture Buffs, and so on and so forth. And just in terms of volumes of tickets, so these segments, how many tickets are they buying actually? And we're seeing in August, Metroculturals really stand out. They're 1/4 of all ticket sales. And whereas in December, they're only 9%. So there's big changes there, and you can see Dormitory Dependables also doubles for the December month compared to August. So a much more middle engaged family groups in December, and August is just very, very highly engaged experience seekers and Metroculturals. And Community Culture Buffs is just the only one that seems to have a constant throughout both of these key months. Now, if we merge the two things we've just seen, so a local, non-local split and audience spectrum profile, this is what it looks like. So here we have the the solid color is your local bookers, and the sort of textured bit of the bar is tickets from outside the area, so people coming into the local area, the visitors.
Elise, can I just,
yes.
Kirsty Dixon at Edinburgh International Festival just asked, when we're defining local bookers,
Yeah.
we're talking about East Central Scotland, aren't we?
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
Thank you. Yes, local area is East Central Scotland, outside area is outside of that. And yes, again, we're seeing still a dominance of obviously local bookers, but different proportions in August or December. And again, more in those higher engaged segments, more people from outside the area in August. And one thing that I found interesting with dormitory dependables is you can see in December, the proportion of tickets from the outside the area stays the same from August to December, but the local proportion almost doubles. So sometimes you have subtle changes like that, or like home and heritage. There's small, a modest size, but much more from outside the area in August compared to December. And even community and culture buffs, who we were saying before, they were very constant. Well, actually, if we look under the surface, there is a bit of variation with more non-local bookers in August. So this was just to give a sort of overview of how the audience splits in terms of different segments, in terms of if they come from outside or if they're local, and in terms of times of year. Now, what we're going to take another look at, actually, before we do that, if are there any questions? Because I know it's just a lot of information to dump all at once. Feel free to post any in the chat or just unmute yourself and ask a question if there's anything.
I just put another observation while people are having a moment to think about that, which is just looking at those two highly engaged, relatively more urban groups, the metroculturals and experience seekers. So yes, we've said they fall back heavily in December, but there's almost none of them from outside of this area in December. So it's not as falling back overall, but that particular group's really collapsed. So, and partly, I guess that means that if you're thinking about where you might be doing targeted marketing relative to, for December productions, etc.,
It's
either
basically
there's an opportunity or a reason to say let's actually really focus in on those huge concentrations we have locally, because people just aren't travelling.
It's obviously basically to do with the festivals effect. So August is the summer festivals, as you know, and then December is probably what we now call the winter festival, which has been growing. But I think the data kind of suggests that perhaps locally the winter festival might there might be bigger local pockets of people in the city in December during winter festival time. So
yes, there's more activity but maybe less engagement.
Yeah, and as we all know in the room as well, that like there's there is no other sort of city like Edinburgh, for that kind of for those peaks, that it is a truly kind of amazingly interesting but slightly awkward city from that point of view, actually. So yeah, anyway.
Thanks. Yes, very important contributions. And just to say, these slides will be shared with you later, so you can always come back and have another look if this would be useful for you. So yes, we were looking at the pre-COVID benchmark picture, and now we've honestly called it the change analysis. We're looking at how things have changed, essentially, as much as we can see not really post-COVID, but in post-lockdowns and restrictions. And for that, we're comparing this pre-COVID benchmark to the last year of available data, which is now September 2021, October 2021 to September 2022. So the first thing I'm going to show you is how things have changed for this group of local organizations we were just looking at. So comparing this benchmark before COVID to the last year of available data, we've seen a drop in performances of 12%, well, 12% lower, and a drop in tickets, minus 31%. So a bigger drop in tickets issued than in performances programmed. And just looking at the average number of tickets sold per performance, it's minus 16% again. So this is just for this one cohort of local organizations we were looking at. The picture, of course, will vary from organization to organization. And I'm also very aware that our sample today is quite heavily skewed towards performing arts. And I know there's a few of you in the room from museums or libraries, and your picture might look quite different. But this is sort of just what we're seeing right off the bat as an overall trend, which is relatively close to what we're seeing nationwide as a trend, if a little bit better, maybe a slightly smaller drop than what we've kind of seen in other places. And if we go back to looking at our audience spectrum segments, this very funky looking graph, every line is a different segment, and we're looking at how the number of bookers from each segment evolves through the years. And if you take 100, so where all the lines start together as the figure that segment had in 2016-17, and then every year after that, the change represents sort of how much higher or lower it is to 100. That's sort of how to read that graph. And we've grayed out the area just around the 100 line, because that's sort of a 5% increase or decrease, and we don't want to focus too much on such a small change. But essentially, we were seeing pre-COVID a sort of upwards trend for most segments. And then, of course, with the pandemic, everything dropped down. And now segments are coming back up, but in slightly different proportions. And the gap between each line is slightly wider than it was pre-COVID towards the start of the graph. What we're seeing essentially is coming out on top, let's say this year, we have the frontline families and trips and treats and experience seekers. So those are the ones that they're still under the 100 line. So they still dropped, but they dropped less than some of the groups like home and heritage, supported communities. So this is sort of a general sort of bird's eye view of how audience numbers changed with the pandemic. It's a pretty striking picture with this big plummet. But what we're really interested in is this aftermath picture, how things are evolving now, and which groups are coming up more than others. And this graph is a little bit confusing. So an easier way to look at it is this next slide with lovely stacked bars. And what this is showing the same thing, just as a more of a end result picture. So this is your local bookers as a percentage of pre-COVID sales. So again, looking at this last year available data. So where you're seeing trips and treats from frontline families, 103, 101%. That means they're just over the level of sales that was pre-COVID. So this is level of tickets sold to local bookers. And this is really just showing the segments that are the strongest colors are the ones that are coming up the most, and the more faded colors are the ones that haven't been coming up as much. So we see home and heritage, 49%. So they're almost, they're under half the volume of tickets they would have sold in a typical year pre-COVID. And even metroculturals, which we were talking about earlier, who are, highly engaged, a fairly reliable segment. Here, they're only 67% of their pre-COVID sales levels as of September 2022. So this kind of is a good sort of summary view of how things might be changing this year compared to what was the status quo pre-pandemic. And what's interesting for Edinburgh is how trips and treats and frontline families are really coming out quite strongly, even though they're small proportions of the actual booker profile, but they are the ones that are really, you know, coming out on top and keeping the attendance going. And some of the groups that we might have relied on before, such as community and culture buffs, you know, they're down to 60% of their pre-COVID sales. So we are expecting some change, not only in the number of tickets and sold and that sort of thing, but also in the makeup of the audience and who attends and who doesn't. And of course, this will have probably consequences on the programming choices and that sort of thing. Now, this is the profile view, but if we look back at our view of tickets sold month by month, what we're seeing is this. So in grade bars, the pre-COVID benchmark, which I showed earlier, and the months are in a different order. This is just to reflect the year of data we're looking at, October 2021 to September 2022. And we had still our December and August bars as being the highest. And so in purple, in dark purple, is the ticket sales in the last 12 months. And what's interesting here is we can see, if we take into account how there was this sort of final easing of COVID rules at the end of January 2022, where venues weren't required to apply social distancing indoors and weren't required to mandate masks indoors and all that sort of thing. Right after that, we see from March onwards, the ticket sales come back really strongly compared to the benchmark, and even surpassing the benchmark after in July and in April. And so if we think back to what we were saying earlier about how there was a drop in tickets of 31%, actually, if we look at the drop pre this easing of COVID rules, pre-January, it's 56% down, and afterwards it's only 19%. So so the picture is kind of skewed by the fact that in Scotland, the COVID restriction lasted a lot longer than in, say, England. And when we look at the last 12 years of available data, that still includes a whole period, a whole 4 months, where there were quite a lot of restrictions still in place. Ollie, did you want to add something?
I was going to say that the last 12 months, well, the last 12 years.
Oh, yes, thank you. Yeah. I wish we had last 12 years of wonderful data to look at. Wouldn't that be great? Maybe one day. No, of course, last 12 months. Thank you. So yeah, this might be just something to kind of lighten the picture a little bit, to see that it's maybe less doom and gloom than we thought, because actually we've seen the last few months since March, really the numbers are really strong, and even August, which is such a key month for Edinburgh, those ticket numbers were actually quite close to the pre-COVID levels. So obviously at the end, when we have the discussion, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how it's been for you personally, but this was just a broad overview that I thought was really useful to see how we're faring compared to the benchmark. And just very quickly, yeah, sorry.
Ashley Smith-Hammond from Create Scotland had a question about, can we say anything about the nature of the content on offer in October, November, December 21? So obviously Ashley's question is about digital and streaming work, and whether obviously we weren't in restrictions, and then we went back into restrictions.
Oh, right.
A lot of pantos were cancelled and things. You know, I don't think we can probably say in this context, like the detail of the performances that we're reporting on, but with a closer look across the organisations, we probably can look at that actually. So
yeah, unfortunately, Audience Finder does not collect online events data.
Yeah.
But we do have something in just a moment about different art forms in this ticketing profile. But I would say, considering the restrictions, December fared pretty well in terms of tickets sold.
Until everyone was shut again, yeah.
They still got a fair bit in. But considering that happened, it's still a very decent picture compared to the benchmark. And thank you for pointing out the questions. I don't always have an eye on the chat, so it is useful.
Don't worry. You can't. Yeah, you can't do both, Elise. Nobody can.
Right.
One thing this does also highlight is that because we're talking about the dominance of August and December, like how this month that we're currently in will obviously have quite a big picture and impact in terms of how the whole year shapes up. So it's immediate feedback on how things are going now.
Yes.
Quite clear, but you can kind of see the comparison from last year about how far down it was to kind of
yes. Exactly, and we will be in the starting blocks around February or March to analyze how this year's December did compared to the previous years. So expect some more from us around then. Just very quickly, this is average tickets per booker sold, with again the dark purple being last 12 months, which shows a similar picture that essentially where there was a drop in overall ticket numbers, there was a drop in average tickets per booker. So it was not only that fewer people were coming, but also they were booking fewer tickets. This was just a little bit of extra information. So now, as I was saying, we're going to look at different genres, different art forms, as we call them at the Audience Agency. And this is volume of tickets sold by art form. And this is the pre-COVID benchmark to start with. So this is how it was in a typical year that we could find pre-COVID. So we see, of course, December really dominated by Christmas shows. Whatever's not Christmas show is mainly dance, a little bit of musical theatre and film. Still quite a lot of these Christmas show sales in January as well. And then the other big month, August, a lot of music, a lot of plays, dance, and then this gray bar of all other art forms combined, because I just ran out of space on the chart. And that's a lot of, for August, that's a lot of outdoor arts, family programs, that sort of thing. Sorry if I'm glossing over the other months a little bit, but I was just focusing on the big ones with big differences. But if the other months are more useful for you to look at, again, the slides are available afterwards for you to study further. So this is the pre-COVID benchmark, and we're going to overlay on top of that the last 12 months. And this is what we're seeing. So we saw a little bit that drop. But what's interesting is the larger share of dance in December that really grew. And the share of Christmas shows shrunk a bit, and again we know it's because of these restrictions that came in. And then in August we see that gray bar at the top, all other art forms shrunk quite a bit, and that was a lot of those outdoor arts and family programs. Now it might be because of how Audience Finder is run, it might be that certain organizations because they code their own performances, they might have coded them differently, we don't know. But it could also suggest a drop in family programming, which is interesting when we note that the family groups have been the one coming back, some of those, the ones coming back more strongly. So maybe there's something to think about there. Now, what other changes to note?
Shall I just toggle between the two, just to kind of?
Yeah.
So
Thanks.
if we go back.
Yeah.
There. And for me, something that stuck out was if you look at the yellow of musical theatre, previous and then post, it's very much compressed to the pockets, which I guess is. It will be about programming and not being able to program in certain months, and then there being more gaps.
But it's interesting that it's one of the real art forms that's driving that big recovery in February and March and April. So it's one of the first things that people are coming back to, really, post restrictions. You know, when it opens up, what's available, what's the first thing I want to see? It seems to be, for some people, it seems to be musical theatre. Yeah.
Elise, we've had a question about whether it's possible to see this in percentage form, the slide. So
by art form in percentages.
Yeah.
I haven't prepared that, unfortunately, but yes, it would be quite useful.
We could add a table to the slides we circulate, couldn't we?
Yeah,
Yes,
we can add we can add that as a table later. So that will be in the slides. Thank you.
Yeah, and when we say it'll be in the slides, obviously we'll send the presentation round to you all with any extra resources attached. So yeah, so we'll send a percentage picture around to KM. Sorry, KM. I'm not. I can't say what your kind of first name is, but yes, there you go.
Yes.
Christy. Thanks, Christy.
Yes. So.
Yes. So it's a really interesting comment from Ashley, saying from memory, it felt like in March, April, there were a lot of big musical theatre shows that were delayed, and the one that.
No, that could well be.
Theorising without data, but that's the kind of, you know, it's kind of a good question to ask of the data, to say, well, we think that's what's going on.
Yes.
That does appear to be.
Yes, and people will have had vouchers and that sort of thing from the tickets they had bought pre-COVID.
The other thing we've been seeing, I think, is a tendency for people to be more likely to go out to things which are a kind of a big experience or something which is really quite striking. So you can probably imagine that coming off the restrictions, the first things that people are going, well, actually it's worth taking the plunge, will be the things which are kind of like, you know, big eye-catching musicals and stuff.
Yes. So just on this last 12-month picture, we're going to focus in on a few art forms and look at their audience spectrum profile to add an extra layer. And I think if you click, there we go, it just highlights the ones we're going to look at, just to not confuse you too much with too many stacked bars all at once. I'm aware this presentation is just stacked bar central. So we're looking at music, dance, and Christmas shows, just because they were really the key ones that drew differences in those 2 key months of December and August. So you've got dance in similar proportions, similar volume of tickets in December and August. And then you got obviously August dance versus music as the two sort of main ones. Could have brought plays into there. I didn't, but we'll see that it probably wouldn't have made a difference. And then obviously we've got dance versus Christmas shows in December. So just on the next slide, here you have, to start us off, music. The first bar is in August, and then the next bar is just music the rest of the year. So just to highlight the fact that the profile of visitors in August for music is quite different. It's very much these 3 higher engaged groups. That proportion of volume of tickets for experience seekers looks probably double, more than double. And we can see the middle engaged segments and up our street are taking up a lot more of the profile for music the rest of the time. So it's not just that if you're programming music, you should mainly cater to those top 3 segments in terms of booker behaviors and how you're marketing it to them, but the depending on when you're programming it, if it's part of the festival season or not, you might get different people coming. The next, I think we're looking at dance. There you go. Again, August versus December, those 2 big months. And again, we're seeing a similar picture. We can really see that profile of dance and music in August are almost identical, which is why I was saying earlier, probably plays we could expect to be the same. It seems that in August, in the festival month, it's really, that's the defining feature rather than which art form they're going to. It kind of looks like the same profile, which makes sense because you think of the festival month as, you know, a lot of people like to go see lots of different things all at once. So that sort of makes sense to us when we look at these profiles. And finally, if we compare dance in December versus Christmas shows, so the two really only art forms we're seeing in December, again, we're seeing quite a difference in profiles, where the dance that's being put on has a higher percentage of these higher engaged groups, especially experience seekers, community and culture buffs. And the Christmas shows attract a wider audience. It's much more balanced, and it has the highest proportion of those middle engaged segments out of any of these groups we've looked at. So again, it suggests that people who go, the dance that's being programmed in December is maybe the slightly more highbrow programming of that month, and again might just give some pointers to how those different genres might be marketed or might be programmed. There we go. Any further comments or questions about these art form splits? Great. So one last thing to show you about these more recent bookers is we just wanted to look at these two groups, community-led culture buffs and experience seekers, and look at the sub-segments, which we touched on a little bit earlier. So C1 and C2, and then E1 and E2. We know that E1 is the, in the population even, is the really, really dominant one. And then C1 is the more family group of the community and culture buffs, it's prosperous families, and C2 is more sort of wealthy empty nesters. Yeah, E1 is the midlife professionals, and E2 is more the students or recent graduates. And really what we're seeing here is, in terms of, again, volume of tickets sold, we really have different splits depending on the different segments, where E1 is really dominant throughout, whereas C1 and C2 kind of share, it kind of alternates which one is dominant. And this is what I tried to show with this line at the bottom, which maybe, I don't know if it's as clear as it could be, but if the line is red, it means C1 is dominant. If the line is green, it means C2 is dominant. If the line is dotted, it's dominant, but it's close. It's a close call. So we're seeing the C2, what did I say? The empty nesters being more dominant in August. Whereas, again, unsurprisingly, I think I got that last line wrong. It should be red at the end of December. It's the C1 are dominant. But in contrast, E1 are just dominant all the time. So it really are those like midlife professionals rather than the students who are driving, or the recent graduates who are driving that that trend. Yes, thanks. Thanks, Ollie, for answering that question. Then were there any other comments on anything else we've touched on in this section? This is the end of the section where we look at booking data. So there we go. If there are any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Otherwise, I will hand back to Ollie to add a little bit more context before we move on to the discussion.
So this next bit, we're just trying to add a little bit sort of more information about some of these groups that we've talked about a bit. This is particularly where we're drawing in information from the Cultural Participation Monitor. So at various points on the way through where I've said this group is inclined to come back, or this week doing that, that's partly for the change analysis. It's partly from this national survey data. So this isn't data specific to East Central Scotland. This is how the groups that we've been talking about in these areas are talking in a sort of wider national overall picture. And the key thing, which I think we saw come out through that profiling, was that age is a really massive differentiator, and occupation linked to age. So particularly, for example, we have consistently asked people if there was something on that you were interested in seeing, which of these statements best applies to you. I'd be happy to attend, I'd consider attending with reservations, not comfortable, etc. And these numbers have been, progressively coming back over the last couple of years, and we've really seen, the dial shift on that. But still, we're seeing much lower proportions, for example, from people who are retired than people who are students saying that they're happy to attend. So there is a sense that some of these older groups are just a bit more reluctant to engage. And we're seeing that in the profile with things like home and heritage, community land culture buffs, settled communities, etc. So all the groups that are on average a little bit older are the ones who are least likely to have come back. So we can kind of see that playing through. There's an interesting paradox here, though, because community land culture buffs are relatively likely to say they're happy to attend, but we can see in the data that in practice they're not. So what seems to be happening is that maybe their overall attitude might have shifted. So they're like, it's not that I won't attend because I like culture, I'm interested in culture, but when push comes to shove, maybe I'll just end up attending a little less often, or be a little bit more reluctant to go, a little bit less inclined. And I don't know whether you've seen this, with older people, that often there is that little sort of greater reluctance or maybe reduced frequency of attendance that's driving the kind of drop in sales. So there's that distinction there. If we look at the people who said they haven't actually done things in the last 12 months, whether it's online, in person, or participatory, we see a similar kind of pattern where the student groups, the young groups, are relatively more likely to have done all of those things, particularly online stuff. Experience seekers as well, sort of above the line for that, more than everything else. Again, retirees a little bit lower. But here we are seeing community land culture buffs, at least online, are a little bit dropped back with some of the others as well. So if you are still doing some like digital content, again, that's a group that are really culturally engaged, they're interested. We're not seeing them turning up in person, but we're also not really seeing them turning up online. So it's not like that's a different way to reach these people that aren't coming back. It's just a bit of a drop in general. Okay. We've also asked people the extent to which they're worried about the impact of the cost of living crisis on them and their household. And this is from late September, early October. So in a way, this would have got worse because this was just pre the last Prime Minister, if we remember her, and her announcement of sort of like, this is what we're doing in the budget. So at that point, we were already seeing a vast majority of the population saying that they were actively concerned about this. So in this, essentially, cost of living has already started to swamp COVID as being the thing that people are most conscious of, and being most conscious of in terms of how it will affect cultural attendance. So this is a proportion that said that they either agree or strongly agree that they're worried about the impact of cost of living on them and their household. The proportion that strongly agree was almost 50% of the population. Again, that will have gone up. So loads of people concerned about it, but within that, we are again seeing sort of slightly differing patterns. But here, the older groups are less likely to be concerned. Whereas some of those younger groups, the ones that we were seeing coming back, being relatively more engaged post-COVID, are the ones that this is landing on particularly, which suggests we might have a particularly tricky dynamic going on, where half the audience was put off by COVID and the aftermath, and the other half of the population are now being put off for other reasons. So that I guess is the risk, and this is where we might want to just check to see how particular groups are and aren't responding, and in practice, and particularly looking at the next couple of months to see whether that carries on. What we are seeing is expected drops in engagement But interestingly, experience seekers are relatively less likely to say they'll do fewer paid for things, even though they say they're really worried about the cost of living. So what we have here is younger, highly engaged groups who are more personally identified with the idea of being culturally engaged and into the arts, and they're saying this is a massive deal. It's going to affect me a lot, but I'm maybe a bit more likely to attend anyway because it matters to me. Whereas some other groups will say, well, it's affecting my finances, and it's not so important to me that it isn't going to be really quite high up on the list of things that I cut back on. However, experience seekers are then particularly in the market for free stuff. So if they see other opportunities to engage which are lower cost, they'll take them. Retired groups less likely to do that, but again, they're just a little bit less likely to be keen to engage in general anyway. So there you see a slightly different picture for different people in terms of how they're responding to this change of context. So we can see let's jump. Let's start with the highly engaged groups. So these three at the top. There is concern about COVID amongst some of these higher engaged groups. In a way, the fact that they're really motivated helps pull them up, but they're still looking likely to drop. And because they're so dominant in the original audience, even relatively small drops in these groups have a relatively big impact on your overall audience, if that makes sense. Because you can afford quite a big drop in groups that don't engage very much, and there won't make a huge amount of difference. But for these, we're really seeing it being quite key. And to some extent, I think for some of these highly engaged older groups, we see a sort of people coming to a bit of an accommodation with COVID and risk involved, and just saying, we just have to live normally with it. But living normally with it might mean that we just do a bit less than we did, and we just accept that that's just the new normal. So I think that's a little bit of that going on with that group. Metroculturals often say they are, relatively speaking, quite concerned about COVID, and I think that's partly about age, and it's partly about being a very urban metropolitan group. They're expecting to be, in and around, and it's, they're not like in an isolated rural hamlet where they can kind of keep themselves and know they're going to be fine. But experience seekers are, this key group, keen to come back. We've seen there's lots of them. We've seen where they are. We've seen that they are, engaging particularly. Some art forms rather than others, but they're likely to be quite important. I think particularly in Edinburgh in the coming period. Then we've got this sort of slightly challenging picture, I guess, in terms of the sort of middle engaged groups who were happy to attend. So they're saying that attending itself isn't the issue. We've seen that play through in the data and the change analysis. But also families and middle income families are particularly impacted by the cost of living, particularly likely to say to reduce their expenditure. And for some of these groups, probably more dormitory dependables than trips and treats, but the rise in mortgage interest rates is likely to particularly bite for them. So that bit of the picture is likely to be the bit that's really, really tricky. But yes. But they were looking like a really good prospect, and now we'll sort of see how that plays out. Yes, generally speaking, the Scottish picture is kind of in line with the UK overall, maybe with a little bit more caution. But yeah, as we see, the actual attendance seems to be coming back, compared to other areas reasonably well. So. Finally, one more complicated chart, but so this one is particularly, if we initially focus particularly on the vertical axis. So this was based not just on local audiences, but on a particular snapshot of May-June attendance for a bigger sample of organisations, but yeah, still a few. I think it's like 100 organisations across the UK. looking at pre and post engagement levels, and you can see the groups that tend to be coming back and engaging were family groups, which again is matching this kind of picture we're seeing. Family groups, middle engaged groups, some of these higher engaged groups dropping below that previous line. Now, the other axis is the proportion that are saying they're worried about COVID, they're worried about catching COVID. But notably, the key thing here really is if we look at the ones who had been coming back, often were coming back even though they thought the COVID was a risk, you know, that top right hand corner, a little bit more worried than average, much more likely to attend. I guess, again, family audiences, you kind of, you know the disease risks that come with having children, not to be too blunt about it. Then when we look at the cost of living, look at the groups that said they were most concerned about the impact of cost of living, they're all, yeah, oops. So all the groups that were most likely to come back are the ones who are most sort of potentially reduced by cost of living as a factor. So that suggests we've got this slightly, you know, tricky balance that I talked about before about, you know, the two different halves of the audience being sort of pressured by different areas. So the question is, what do we think that means? And so I'm going to give a few headline thoughts and then open up to you, and you can tell me more locally informed things, and also maybe if you are happy to share a little bit about how you're seeing sales responding, or which particular things you think people are responding to or going back for, or whatever. And we won't record that bit, so you can sort of speak freely amongst friends. No, there's not going to be something you record if you're happy to. So, the overall thoughts, just based on the overall things that we've seen. So in the overall area, we've got lots of these highly engaged groups. That's a good starting point. They're overrepresented in the population, they're overrepresented amongst attenders, even relative to that, as you would expect, but it means it's really highly concentrated amongst those groups. There is a strong inward draw in terms of Edinburgh, and you would expect that, but nonetheless, these local audiences are, you know, a big chunk of who's actually engaging, and that means that that local profile becomes really key. And the spatial split of that profile, so where these different clusters are, which is why we shared the mapping earlier, again, because some of these groups are so concentrated, hopefully that gives you quite a sort of sharp picture on where these particular attenders are likely to be. However, we've seen this kind of tension between different groups, different attitudes to COVID, and particularly looking amongst those three highly engaged groups, it's really the experience seekers who are the ones who appear to be holding up in terms of post-COVID engagement, albeit likely to be affected by the cost of living, but it looks like they might still try and push through that because culture matters to them so much. So worth noting, but also recognising there will be price sensitivity in there. Families also, you know, it does seem to be a driver that holds up pretty well against sort of all sorts of pressures about attending. So that's probably something to look for. And the overlap between those, that E1 subsegment, which I suspect a few people on this call are in, where you've got, you know, graduate families within the, you know, within these areas, may be particularly key as a kind of target group. Also, some of the lower engaged groups actually appear to be holding up relatively well, considering, albeit at lower volumes, some things like Facebook families. And anyway, it's probably worth saying, given the overall profile, it feels like some of those groups are relatively lower engaged than they could be. So again, that might flag an opportunity for kind of more broadly inclusive approach, albeit they're probably appealed to by slightly different offers. So here's a question. It is a question rather than a statement, I think. But we saw that 31% drop in overall sales and a 16% drop in programming, and off the top of my head, is it 13% drop in tickets per event? So to some extent, fewer events was going to bring that total number of ticket sales down anyway. So is there a question about reduced programming starting to drive that kind of level of lower engagement, and or is there a thing about, you know, reduced engagement reducing habits, and therefore that then having a knock-on impact? So there may be a question mark there about you know, reining in programming or reining in opportunities to engage might actually have a cascading effect. That said, we're seeing younger people and young groups being relatively more enthusiastic, keen to go out and do things. There's probably a shift of thinking about maybe sort of heritage offer between, you know, more of the kind of leisure stroke learning skew to heritage engagement as opposed to the kind of older, sort of more traditional museum visitor. So that might be something to think about. But yes, and also we've got this really high concentration on these 2 particular months, which obviously does potentially create some risks. I mean, even this morning, for example, you know, new rail strikes being announced over Christmas. That, given the concentration on December, losing 3, you know, a serious chunk of audiences on 3 days might be enough to make a bit of a dent in a way that wouldn't be the case with a much flatter kind of event profile. So yes, so that's some observations from our perspective, but obviously you'll have all sorts of other things to say, I'm sure.